introduced the whole program and talked about the nature of comparative studies in education. And then on the second session last week on Wednesday, we talked about professionalism in teaching for the 21st century. I should also say that this morning I have updated the course outline, so there's a new version of the course outline on the e-learning pages. So it's just updated. It's nothing that's different. It's just a few things have been added to it. Now, the session last week, we actually ran out of time because it took too long. I had too many slides, and you kindly stayed on, most of you, but we agreed that we would start today, not by going straight into today's topic, which I'll outline in a few minutes, but we'd start by having a discussion that I had planned to include last time. And it was on this question: what are the characteristics that make teaching a profession? Now, if you've managed to do some of the follow-up reading, perhaps from the European Journal of Teacher Education, which was on the list, you may have some additional ideas. But I think we're going to put you into small groups now and ask you to discuss this question for maybe 7 or 8 minutes and see if you can list the main characteristics that make teaching a profession rather than a craft or a manual occupation. So, okay, is that possible to put students into groups now? I put up that diagram as well, which came from the BERA report, which you might find helpful as you have these discussions. So I'll stop talking if Monica can put us all into groups, and then in 7 or 8 minutes we'll ask for a bit of feedback from those discussions. Is that all right, Monica?
Yes, that's fine. Okay, so we move into groups now, and we will have this group discussion about the characteristics that make teaching a profession. We can allow for maybe 10 minutes, Jan,
Okay.
or yeah, it's 10 minutes we can have, or yeah.
Yeah, that's
I
fine.
think it can be fine. Okay, we are 30. I will try to put you in 10 groups, maybe. So three students per group. Okay. Okay. We will see what happens with us. Maybe you will be directed towards a group as a member. It can be because I'm the organizer. I'm the one that I'm left outside. It is just me.
All right.
But
well,
you,
last time I tried this, it all went wrong. So I just let the groups have their discussion and wait until they're ready to feedback.
Yeah, if you wish, I can choose you to stay outside. I will try to find you and put you outside. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see what is happening. You are still here with me, Yeah, you stay here. Okay, so you can choose to stay here. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Join.
Yeah. So the students are. This is strange. I made 10 groups, but I see a lot of people per group. I don't know why. Strange. There are just 3 interactive sessions somehow. I don't know why.
Just 3 groups.
Just
Or
3
maybe
groups. This is not correct. I don't know why. I will. Let me see if I can change. It's strange. I will do it again because this is not okay. Sorry.
okay.
Okay, we just is also slow to this with this sessions. Yeah, I have selected the wrong way maybe. Oh. Okay, now I can do it again. Okay. Are they, are they all outside? Siete tutti fuori dai gruppi, ragazzi, ragazze? E cos'è successo? Che eravamo in 30 e siete rimasti in 23? Non riesco a capire.
Noi nel nostro gruppo eravamo in 6.
No, no, ma in totale partecipanti vedo 23. Prima eravate in 30. Sorry, just communication about the number of students coming and going, because from 30, we were on 30, now we are 23. So I will create 10 sessions, maybe 2 people per group. So let's see how it works.
Okay.
Okay. Strano. Okay, I was checking. I did it manually. The people in a manual way because.
Do you think
Okay.
they've had long enough now for discussion?
I think let's let them something like still 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or something to talk about because I moved them
Okay.
between groups because. Fabio and Esther, I don't know, these people are out of the groups, it appears.
Are they in a group with us, perhaps? But their microphones are turned off, I think.
I will try to see what is happening here.
I think because we are connected on our phone.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay right now, yes.
You are okay. I moved them to session 10. Two other people, Alexandra is just now who came in, maybe. Yeah. Okay. And then this other student that I know well, Silvia Marti. So you are out of your group?
Yes. The connection was I don't know, because I was just just alone in the session. I don't know why.
You are alone on the session?
Yeah.
I cannot see you
there
here.
There was another girl. There was another girl, but now she disappeared.
Okay. Well. I cannot see your name here to move you somewhere. I cannot find you as someone. So you are in which session? Sorry.
I don't know, because the first one was 10, and I don't know. Oh, lost.
Marti.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I have the feeling that they deserted the group work because we were in 30 and this never happened with the group during the first part of the year. Never happened to have such a a variability of people at any time. But we have groups that can be very different at times. It's good to let them some time to discuss between them because they do not have the chance to talk to each other. And I will try to move between groups to see what they are saying, just a little bit.
Monica, that's good.
Allora, siamo rientrati. We are back all together, and of course, as I suggested, maybe you can have a short list of ingredients, how to say, of aspects that you think that are relevant for the profession. If you have a more developed thought, you can, of course, share it with us, but it can be useful to have a very logical way of approaching my view, just to have a feedback from you. What do you think, Ian?
Yeah, do you think we can have verbal feedback? Or will they...
Sure.
Right. I'd be very interested to hear if you've got a list of characteristics.
Mhm.
Which group would like to start? Or which person? Let's have a volunteer.
Yeah. So you can please start. It doesn't matter the number of the group, you just can volunteer. Yeah.
If I can start.
Yeah.
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. We said that teaching is a profession because a teacher has to be prepared and qualified to do their work. So have a recent qualific at the university, and they have to have a shared ethic code as other professionalism of, for example, psychologists or doctors. And all the approaches have to be based on a method. Also, the most innovative has to have rules to not become only summer camp, we said, but school. And then teacher has to be continuously informed about the innovation of their work to improve their professionalism and integrate it with the practice. So also with practice in class and in school.
That's very good, Julia. Thank you very much indeed. I think by what you are saying, it's about having a university-based training, the preparation for teaching. It's about having particular methods that are used in teaching, and it's about having particular knowledge that makes you into a teacher. All these things help to make you into a profession. Any more anybody want to add anything a bit different to that?
Yes, we wondered, are we a professionals in a specific subject? And we don't think so. But our training is a global training, and it's very important because it offers a multidisciplinary approach. And I think that teacher training must be continuous.
Must be
continuous,
going on throughout the career. Yeah, that's very interesting as well. So there's a debate about whether you are a mathematics teacher first or whether you're a teacher first, or are you a Italian teacher or a teacher first. And I think it's interesting if we compare primary school and secondary school teachers, because primary school teachers, certainly in this country, see themselves very much as one body. In secondary schools, sometimes subject teachers see themselves as kind of subgroups of the profession. So that is an interesting question. Has anybody got anything to say about the ethics of the teaching profession?
Yes, I came across a group that were actually discussing about the ethics.
Right. Could they report as well and make that the final report, perhaps? Which group was that, Monica?
I can't remember now, but one group was discussing about that. Maybe Angela, if I remember the name, Angela Tornaquindici.
Yes, I'm here, but I'm afraid I can't talk a lot because my baby is sleeping between my arms.
Don't worry.
I'm sorry.
I don't want to wake up the baby.
Yeah.
Anybody else in your group, Angela, who could comment?
Group number 7, I think.
Yeah. Anybody else from group 7 who could say, what were you talking about to do with ethics?
We are discussing about communication and
Yeah.
communication skills of teachers. And as I have written to teacher Mincu, I was wondering about the role of media, new media and television, and in this particularly moment of pandemia. In Italy, lots of TV programs are presented by teachers.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, Angela, thank you very much for that. That the aspect of media and communication, I think communication has always been a key element of teaching, but these new media bring new dimensions to that aspect of teacher professionalism. And certainly it does seem that teachers need to be skilled in the use of new media, including social media. So just if I might try and just summarize what you've said in those interesting reports back, it seems to me that you are talking about teachers being a profession because they have a particular route of training, of entry into the occupation. You have to train and get a qualification. You have to have develop a particular set of knowledge and skills which are distinctive to the teaching profession. You have to have part of the knowledge will be subject knowledge, especially for secondary teachers, but also for primary teachers. And then the communication skills and the media point is a very interesting one. What I might have added, and I thought you were going to say this, is that teachers need a code of ethical behavior, which is about not damaging or hurting the learner in any way. It's actually quite similar to the medical code of ethics, where a doctor has to take make a binding commitment not to hurt their patients. Well, I think teachers have some similar commitment not to emotionally or psychologically damage the children that they're working with. So I think all of these factors do add up to make it quite clear that teaching is a profession and should be treated with the respect that a profession deserves. That would be my summary. I don't know, Monica, do you want to add anything to that?
I would underline actually this idea in that you just expressed the importance of the deontological or ethical side of the profession. I think we do not talk enough about this, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think we do not talk enough about it in Italy too, maybe, and at the university level as well. And I think it is much more clear what you are, the discourse and the importance that you have of the ideas around this in England, in my view, my perception. I don't know what the students may think about, but I think there is space to really be more aware of this.
Right. Well, we may have another chance to discuss that issue later on, I think. But I think I should probably now start into today's session proper. Remember, and thank you all very much for those contributions. I hope you found that discussion helpful. What I want to talk about today is schooling in the United Kingdom, because I'm not sure how many of you have visited Britain, but I expect some of you have, some of you haven't. I want to try and give you a feel for what goes on in schools in the United Kingdom. And this talk is based partly on a presentation as long ago as 2012 at the BERA conference, the British Education Association conference, but also on data work as well. And what I'm going to cover is these 5 sections. An introduction, first of all, which I'm in at the moment, then to say something about teacher agency and curriculum creation, the curriculum, the relationship between the teacher and the curriculum. And that draws on work by colleagues Dominic Wise and Carmel Gallagher. Then thirdly, go on to say something about assessment and teacher agency. And I hope the phrase teacher agency will come to mean something for you by the end of this session. You may not be clear about it now, but I'll try and explain what I mean by teacher agency. And that section is co-authored with Louise and Moira Hugh. Then in the fourth section, something about teachers and pedagogy, the actual skills of teaching and learning. And that relies on work with Vivian Bomefield. And finally, curriculum, pedagogical and assessment change, to try and get a sense of how things have been changing in the United Kingdom for teachers and for their learning and development. And that relies on work with Ruth Leach and Kay Livingston. So those are the sections I'm going to work through. The pre-reading I asked you to do, and I hope some of you have managed to do this. Firstly, there's a chapter in this book here, which is called An Introduction to the Study of Education, a chapter that some of us who worked on this have written about compulsory education in the United Kingdom. Of course, the word compulsory reminds us that children have to attend school in the UK, in the United Kingdom, between the ages of 5 or 4 in some parts and 16. And then the second reading is a chapter from this book here, edited by Dominic Wise and Sue Rogers, A Guide to Early Years and Primary Teaching. I think most of you are heading for primary teaching, and not all of you. And this is a chapter that considers the relationship, I'm sorry about that, the relationship between school and society. So I hope you can draw on that reading as we go through. For me, the key points in those two readings, in the first of them on compulsory education, is the whole question of the relationship between education and national identity. Schools are always organized around a particular or by a particular nation. In the United Kingdom, as we shall see, it's actually 4 different nations, but for each of those 4 nations, the way in which education is structured, the way in which the curriculum is shaped, is closely tied to how national identity is seen, how it is to be English or Welsh or Scottish or Northern Irish. And in that chapter also, we pick up differences between the educational provision in those 4 nations. There's then some reference, I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, to the message systems. There was a very great sociologist of education called Basil Bernstein, and again, I'm not sure if you will have come across his work before, but he talked about the 3 message systems of education, and those message systems, curriculum, pedagogy, and what he called evaluation. We'll say more about those in a moment. And then also Raymond Williams, who's a great hero of mine. I'm writing a book about Raymond Williams and education at the moment. I'll say more about it in a minute, but he talked about 3 different historical influences on schooling, particularly in England. So those are some of the key points from that first reading. From the second reading, which is on school and society, we explore there the links between the primary school and the community and try and draw out how significant a child's first schooling experience is likely to be. But we also draw out 3 specific traditions of primary education in England. And I'm not sure the extent to which these 3 traditions will be relevant in Italy. You might want to comment on that later. But the 3 traditions drawn out by Alan Blythe are the preparatory, the elementary, and the developmental. The preparatory really is simply seeing the primary school as preparation for what you might see as real education later on. It's getting children ready to learn the hard elements of the secondary school curriculum. And that's been very influential in the private sector of education in Britain. The elementary tradition stems back to the 19th century and was really about the expansion of maths schooling for all children in the country. It covered the so-called basics of learning, reading, writing, mathematics, and so on. And then the third tradition was more based on thinking about how children learn, was described as developmental, the idea that children will learn as they grow. I think you'll find, you may have noticed a mention of Montessori in that chapter. She was one of the great influences on the developmental tradition in primary education. And I think in Italy, certainly her influence on the preschool sector has probably been very significant indeed. And we still have in this country Montessori schools that tend to specialize in the preschool or early years of education. So those three traditions, the preparatory, the elementary, and developmental, still influence what goes on in primary schools in Britain, in the United Kingdom today. So those are the two pre-readings. Let's now move into thinking about education across the United Kingdom, schooling across the United Kingdom. It's quite exciting to think of the United Kingdom as what I've called a natural experimental laboratory. You know how a scientist has a clinically controlled laboratory where everything is clean and carefully managed? Well, you can have a natural laboratory when you've got 4 different cases running side by side, and you're not really controlling what's going on in those 4 cases. You're letting them unfold and develop themselves, and it's therefore why I can call it an experimental laboratory. There are differences in the 4 countries that make it very interesting to compare and contrast. So, as I mentioned in the previous sessions, we can have a so-called home international comparative perspective. The term home international actually comes from football and other sports, where England used to play against Scotland, and Scotland played against Wales, and Wales played against Northern Ireland. But that term has been borrowed for educational comparative research. And the work reported in this talk today was work carried out by a group known as CAPER. CAPER has a double meaning in English, but CAPER stood for Curriculum, Assessment and Pedagogy Reform. So we had educational researchers from the 4 different nations of the United Kingdom working together to carry out this kind of home international comparative research. And one of the things that work led to was this book here from 2013 called Creating the Curriculum, which looks at primary education in all 4 parts of the United Kingdom. So I don't know if you will be able to get hold of that, probably not, but I thought I'd let you know that this is the work today is kind of drawing on that book. So this is called the United Kingdom. It's a strange term for something that's actually now in education quite disparate. And pre-1999, all education in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in England, and in Wales, was actually, the policy was determined here in London by the UK government. But after Tony Blair got elected in 1997, he and his government saw through the commitment to devolve responsibility for a number of matters, including education, to local or national assemblies or parliaments. There is a parliament based in Edinburgh. The Scottish government now determines education policy. In Northern Ireland, as you'll be aware, there have been a lot of political troubles which have meant the Northern Ireland Assembly, the governing body, has not consistently met over that time, but there is notionally at least an assembly there which is determining education policy. In Wales, down in, sorry, that's in Belfast, which is on this large-scale map just there. And in Wales, there's a Welsh Assembly government in Cardiff, down in South Wales there, which determines education policy in Wales. Scotland had always had some degree of autonomy in education, even though officially it was decided on in London, but it officially moved to Edinburgh to Scotland in 1999-2000. I think, just say, I think Agnesi has got her microphone on and there's quite a lot of noise perhaps coming from it. Agnesi, yeah? So post-devolution in 1999-2000, education policy became the responsibility of parliaments or assemblies in each of the 4 jurisdictions. So to call it a United Kingdom really does beg a question. I said I would mention Bernstein. Well, he wrote a lot of very important work and has been very influential in educational sociology. But in particular, what I want to draw attention to today is his suggestion that there are 3 important message systems in any education system. Formal educational knowledge, he wrote, can be considered to be realized through 3 message systems: curriculum, pedagogy, and evaluation. Curriculum defines what counts as valid knowledge, what is being learned. Pedagogy defines what counts as a valid transmission of the knowledge. It's about the process of conveying that knowledge to the learner. And evaluation defines what counts as a valid realization of this knowledge on the part of the taught. It's how do you know what they have learned? And the word we would tend to use, certainly in England, much more than evaluation these days, to mean the same thing, would be assessment. So we often talk about curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And that those 3 message systems were the central interest of this group CAPER that I was talking about. So try and hold that idea with you as we go through this session, these 3 message systems for schooling. The second key idea I'd like you to hold with you, which certainly is very important in British education, I wonder if it has the same power in Italy, these ideas are drawn from a book called The Long Revolution, written by a man called Raymond Williams, who was best known as a cultural theorist. But in his book, The Long Revolution, which was trying to depict the progress of British society, particularly during the 20th century, and contrast it with the kind of upheavals and short revolutions, say, that had taken place in the Soviet Union or in China during the 20th century. He talked about this gradual revolution taking place in Britain and suggested that, in fact, education was a key element in that long revolution. And he suggested, in tracing the history of education in Britain, but particularly in England, that there were 3 interest groups that were trying to shape the way education was developing. They had, if you like, different values, different priorities in education. So the first group he called the old humanists. Those were the people that actually believed the main point of education was about reproducing and developing culture. So the great literature, the great art, the great music, the great science, the old humanists would believe in promoting those and would focus very much on those kind of traditions within the curriculum. The second group of interests he depicted as the industrial trainers, and this grouping he suggested saw education as being very much about preparing young people to take their place within the economy, to help to make technological progress in society. So the point of education was to train people in particular skills and occupations where they could then move into a paid employment in an industry or in a business, and that would be the main point of education, was to ensure that the economy developed. So the first group, old humanists, were emphasizing culture. The second group, the industrial trainers, were emphasizing the economy. So what were the third group emphasizing, the public educators? Well, their main commitment was to ensure that the citizens of the country had the ability to play a part in democracy. This was about equipping all learners with good levels of literacy and numeracy, and indeed with political skills as well, so that they could play a full part in the development of the politics of society. So in a sense, you've got a cultural argument, an economic argument, and a political argument. All those three things going hand in hand, each grouping trying to shape education in the way that they saw fit. And at times, there would be real tensions between these groups. So, for example, the industrial trainers might argue that we shouldn't spend too much time reading literature because it would take us away from developing the skills we needed to fit into a paid job in the economy. Or the public educators might be seen as trying to stir up politics and create agitators in the society, people who would be critical of society. So in English or in British education today, you can still see these three groupings trying to shape and influence policy in education. So that's the second idea to hold on to. First one was curriculum, pedagogy, and evaluation. The second one is the tensions between old humanists, industrial trainers, and public educators. Now, to move into talking about the three message systems of education, we're going to take each of the message systems in turn, curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy, to explore what can we learn from looking across the whole of the United Kingdom. What are some of the similarities and differences, and the internal and external influences and policy drivers? Do developments in the message systems, are they complementary or not complementary? Are there tensions and contradictions, or do they actually support each other? Are they aligned with each other? How are teachers positioned in these developments, and what are their responses to these developments? To what extent is there a new context for teacher learning and development in the 21st century? To what extent are teachers given power and influence, what we would call agency in this talk? To what extent do they have agency? How can they shape educational processes, and what is the vision of teaching that's appropriate for the 21st century. And you might remember last week on Wednesday, I talked about the 4 paradigms of the teacher, moving from the effective teacher through to the transformative teacher. Well, the transformative teacher is one who is very agentic, has a lot of agency, but also the vision of that teacher is somebody who is going to bring about, support, and promote positive change in the 21st century. And then finally, to what extent are teachers seen as inquiring curriculum developers, which was how Lawrence Stenhouse, who I said last week, coined the term teacher as researcher in 1975. To what extent do we now see teachers as inquiring curriculum developers? So we're going to go through each of the message systems in turn, and I'm going to say a word or two about each of them. And the first section is looking at teachers and the curriculum and how the extent to which they have an input into shaping the curriculum. This will draw on sociological and philosophical perspectives to consider teacher agency in the United Kingdom, but particularly in England in 2012, and something about the aims of the curriculum, particularly in England. So to go back to Bernstein, he defined curriculum as the principle by which units of time and their contents are brought into special relationship with each other. That's how these, as it were, packages of knowledge and skills are brought together in a particular program of learning, the unit of time in which they are taught and learned in that relationship between teachers and students. Secondly, he talked about how the curriculum is classified, and for classification, he meant the degree of boundary maintenance between contents. You can have, again using Bernstein's terminology, he talked about a collected curriculum in contrast to an integrated curriculum. So in the collected curriculum, you would have lots of different subjects with clear lines between them. You would have mathematics, science to be divided into physics, chemistry, and biology. You would have modern languages, you would have history, geography, physical education. And these subjects would never overlap. They would be taught separately. Even in the primary school, you would have a mathematics lesson followed by a science lesson. At the other end of the classification categorization, you would have an integrated curriculum where the learner would not be aware of particular subjects, but be looking at a particular topic. In the primary school, they might do a focus on something like the seasons of the year and thinking about the scientific aspect of that, the artistic aspects, the language aspects, all around the topic of the 4 seasons. So Bernstein talked about classifying the curriculum. It could be strongly classified, where there are these strong boundaries between subjects, or it could be weakly classified, where the subjects were less important than the actual knowledge, the topic, the focus of study. I'm sorry about my cough today. It just seemed to be irritating my throat.
No problem. You take your breaks in and yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Monica.
No problem, really.
Well, it's not very nice for students to have to listen to me coughing. But I might pause in a few minutes and have a little 2-minute break to try and sort my throat out. But then the other idea that Bernstein had was about the framing within the curriculum. And this was not about the organization of the knowledge so much as how the knowledge was being communicated. So framing is the degree of control that the teacher and pupil possess over the selection, organization, and pacing of the knowledge transmitted and received in the pedagogical relationship. So again, he contrasts strong framing with weak framing. The strong framing would be certainly for the teacher to be very, as we might say in English, didactic, perhaps standing at the front of the class, delivering information, transmitting the knowledge to the students. Whereas the weak framing might be children working in groups, learning from each other, finding things out for themselves, with the teacher much more as a facilitator of learning rather than the transmitter of knowledge. So these two ideas of classification and framing are very important in educational sociology and are still as relevant today, I suggest, as they were in 1971 when Bernstein first put these ideas down on paper. And I was thinking about the comment that was made about communication and media and the social media, the new technologies that we use in teaching. And these would fall very much within the issue of how the curriculum is framed, how it is communicated, how the teaching is done, how the learning is undertaken. And the notion of framing is just as valid in thinking about contemporary technological means of communication as it was in the 1970s. So those are the ideas of classification and framing. And to take it a bit further, we can say that knowledge is permeable and provisional in most cases. Most peoples are denied access to this kind of learning where knowledge is seen as permeable, integrated, flexible. Most, certainly in England today, less so in Scotland and elsewhere, the knowledge that is taught is very strongly classified. It's very strongly subject-based, whereas in the 1960s and 70s, actually when I was a primary school teacher, we would do a lot of integrated teaching where the topic was the key thing that was designed to hold children's interest, a much more relaxed approach to the kind of knowledge that we were teaching. Similarly, in England, especially today, there is a need for weaker classification in recognition that more flexibility is required in the labour force, a need for more egalitarian education, where children and, well, teachers and children have more power to shape the nature of the material that they are learning. And that can only be done if there is a weaker classification of that knowledge. Now, what I've been trying to do in these remarks is to integrate philosophical and sociological perspectives. Both Bernstein in the 1970s and John Dewey in the early part of the 20th century shared a concern about how knowledge is structured in schooling. Dewey's emphasis was on the child's experience and how activity shaped their learning, whereas Bernstein was very concerned about creating fair access for all children in a society where social class tended to lead to children from poorer or from working class backgrounds not to have the same opportunities for educational advancement. He was concerned to make schooling a much more egalitarian, a much more equal experience than it had been. So the kind of psychological and philosophical commitments that Dewey had linked up with the sociological and political commitments that Bernstein had. And that all leads us to the question of who actually controls education and who should control education. To what extent should the state, the government, control education, or should we see teachers or even pupils, students themselves controlling education? Certainly in England, the extent to which the state has taken control has been very, very pronounced since the 1980s. In the time before that, from 1950 through to the 1980s, teachers themselves had much more influence on what was happening in schools. Again, I think Britain was probably quite unusual in that regard, but it was certainly the case that teachers had a lot of influence and responsibility for making decisions about what children should learn. So who controls? That's the English situation. In Scotland, again, if you've read that chapter on compulsory education, you probably have a sense of this already. In Scotland, there's much more democratic engagement between teachers and policymakers. Professionals have a role in mediating what happens in school. Similarly, in Wales, teachers have always been more highly valued than they are in England and have played a part in mediating what goes on in schools. Northern Ireland is a bit of a special case, mainly because of the division in that society between the nationalist and unionist communities, or putting it another way, the Roman Catholic and Protestant communities. And the main issues in teaching in Northern Ireland have been about trying to sustain a stable and peaceful approach to education. So the issues of control and teacher mediation have been a bit different in Northern Ireland from elsewhere in the UK. But the general message from that slide is that teachers in England, especially since the late 1980s, have been much more limited and constrained in the influence they have on what actually happens in schools. And this reached its peak in a legal act of 1988, which was called the Education Reform Act. It was when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in the UK, leading a Conservative government. And in that Education Reform Act, they brought in a national curriculum for the first time. We had not had a national curriculum before that time. A national assessment package where children were to be tested at the ages of 7, 11, and 13, as well as at the school leaving age of 16. And those 4 stages of testing corresponded with 4 so-called key stages of education, from key stage 1 for the youngest children up to key stage 4 for older secondary school children. So essentially, education was reorganized in England from 1988 onwards. When a Labour government came in a few years later in 1997, they did not reverse those innovations, those policies brought in by the Conservative government. Indeed, they added to them by not only controlling the curriculum and assessment, but by bringing in something called national strategies, initially in the primary school, which were really instructions for teachers on how to teach literacy, reading and writing, and how to teach numeracy. So there were particular, very schematic and systematic approaches to literacy and numeracy in primary schools from 1997. So now you had not only curriculum and assessment being controlled, but the pedagogy, the ways in which teachers were teaching, being controlled from the centre. So that did mean that teachers' agency was severely reduced in England, certainly by comparison with the other parts of the UK. In 2010, the Labour government was voted out, and a coalition government of Conservative and Liberal Democrats came in, which started to promote new forms of schooling. They were perhaps less interested in what was happening inside the schools, but were more interested in how schools were managed, organized, and how parents could choose between kinds. They brought in things called free schools and academies. In fact, the academies had been introduced by the new Labour government, but the new coalition government in 2010 built on those and added to them. It's very interesting to look at what politicians say as well as what they actually do, because if you read this statement from the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, he's the lead minister at this time for education in that coalition government. He set out in a letter to a man called Tim Oates his view on the aims of the curriculum. He was responding to a report that Tim Oates and his panel had submitted to the government, and Michael Gove wrote, "I agree with your clear recommendation that we should define the aims of the curriculum." It's interesting that even though we'd had a national curriculum from 1988 onwards, the aims of that curriculum had not been clearly stated. There were lots of assumptions about what it was for, what the national curriculum was for. So Michael Gove said, we need to set ambitious goals for our progress as a nation. And we need clear expectations for each subject. I expect those aims to embody our sense of ambition, a love of education for its own sake, respect for the best that has been thought and written, appreciation of human creativity, and a determination to democratize knowledge by ensuring that as many children as possible can lay claim to a rich intellectual inheritance. A really interesting statement, that, because you can see, I hope, how Raymond Williams's three interest groups are all represented in that statement. Perhaps the strongest element is the old humanist element, the rich intellectual inheritance, human creativity, education for its own sake. But we can also see some element of the public educators in the phrase, a determination to democratize knowledge. So as many children as possible. It's about that public education that schools should be providing, enriching the lives and the democracy, enriching the lives of individuals and democracy for society. And then you can also see the industrial trainers element coming through, not least in the very second sentence, ambitious goals for our progress as a nation. That sense of economic competition is alluded to there. So this was a politician whose actual effect on the curriculum was to narrow it down and to make it very mechanistic. But here he's saying things that it'd be very hard to disagree with from a liberal perspective. So that's my point. Politicians can say one thing and do another. But it's an interesting statement. So our conclusions from the first part of this, the summary of the first part of this, is that you can argue a case for having weaker framing and classification, more integrated knowledge and more interactive teaching than we have had in England in the last 30 or 40 years. That it would be worth seeing knowledge as permeable, flexible, changing, rather than in rigid packages that are delivered a bit like groceries into the learner. So knowledge as permeable rather than little distinct packages of knowledge. And thirdly, a need to reclaim the aims of the curriculum. And I think we probably could agree with Michael Gove on the importance of having clearly stated aims. We just might want to be more precise about what those aims should be. So that's the first section of this, which has covered the curriculum. The second stage is to look at assessment. As I mentioned, Bernstein tended to use the word evaluation, but I'm going to use the word assessment because that equates to much the same thing. When we're thinking about assessment, there are a number of factors to take into account, and coherence is one of them. An education system is coherent when curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and other drivers and incentives are all aligned and reinforce one another. We should expect to see some, when you're planning a curriculum, you'd be planning also how the teaching is to be done and how the assessment is to be done. And it's very important that none of those single message systems undermines any of the others. So this idea of coherence is a complex one in education because it involves the curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment being coherent, all demonstrating the same kinds of values or indeed the same kinds of aims of education. But coherence is also important within assessment. We would want to see that the different assessment procedures are all cohering together and not undermining each other. And different assessment policies, for example, public examinations need to be consistent with the ongoing formative assessment policies that schools are operating. We shouldn't see one undermining the other. We should also see research, policy, and practice. Remember that three-way diagram, that cyclical diagram I had the other day, last Wednesday. Those research, policy, and practice need to be consistent in terms of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment coherence. And the underlying value systems, again relating back to the aims of education, we want to see them being coherent rather than competing with each other. Assessment is an incredibly important part of educational provision. It can reinforce curriculum intentions in powerful ways, or it can impoverish rich curricula by assessing against too narrow a set of measures. We've tended to find all too frequently in England that because of the importance given to these public examinations, the tests that are taken at the end of Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and Key Stage 3, although some of them have now been dropped, they tended to narrow the curriculum. So teachers were only going to teach, or were going to emphasize in their teaching, what it was that was going to be tested. So the tests were narrowly on literacy and numeracy, for example. So children were not getting a very rich and broad curriculum. They were just focusing on spelling, on grammar, on writing, without being, for example, creative. And in mathematics, they were focusing on the number operations in arithmetic to an excessive extent, because that's what was going to be tested. And we argue in this book that teacher agency matters. Teacher agency and assessment. Teachers should be making decisions about assessment, indeed should be carrying out assessments themselves. Not all assessment should be external. So teacher agency can be empowering, can be constrained or constraining. And as Barber and Moorshed said in their influential report for McKinsey Company consultancy firm in 2007, they pointed out that what gets tested or statutorily assessed strongly determines what gets learned, and how it is tested determines how it is learned. Finally, teachers can assess what is easy to assess rather than all that matters in a curriculum. So the danger is that teachers only assess what you can easily measure rather than the more complex, sophisticated elements of the curriculum which are harder to measure the learning. So testing can narrow the curriculum, which would be a great shame. So if we think about teacher agency and assessment, we can argue that there is strong evidence to demonstrate the power of assessment to enhance learning. Actually, good assessment really can help to raise educational standards in school. But that has to be carefully constructed assessment that does not narrow the curriculum. Agency can also focus on powerful pedagogies and be incorporated into powerful pedagogies. A key feature in realizing the potential of assessment for both teachers and learners, new collaborative pedagogies, mutual respect, collaboration, community concern, active engagement, all of these things can be brought into the processes of assessment, enriching the learning experience for the students. And we may note that new curricula in different countries within the UK make different demands on teachers. And this is really similar to the point made earlier on when we was talking about the curriculum. There's a strong sense of teacher agency certainly in Wales and Scotland and probably in Northern Ireland, with a weaker sense of teacher agency in England. So again, summarizing what we've said about assessment here and linking it back to curriculum and pedagogy, effective learning for individuals and for societies, assuming that was the central purpose of trying to achieve coherence, entails the development of meaningful curricula for the world in which young people are likely to live. The curriculum needs to be relevant to today, up to date, and of interest to young people. It needs to be brought to life in learning environments through empowering pedagogy. So the pedagogy, the approaches to teaching and learning that happen in classrooms need to give a sense of power to the teacher and the learner so that they are constructing their own distinctive knowledge based on what they are being offered. And evidence of learning, assessment, that is the evidence of learning, is collected to discern what learning has taken place, what future learning might be, and how best that learning might be developed. So the argument here is that the power lies in the coherence of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. The three message systems need each to support the other. In all four UK countries, there has been a concern to raise attainment, to improve outcomes. But there are different views of teacher agency, the extent to which teachers are responsible for that. Teacher summative assessment is seen as important in some parts of the UK. Externally designed tests are seen as more important in others. All are involved to different extents in the dream of driving up standards. So we would acknowledge that you need all kinds of approaches to assessment in order to improve outcomes in education. In England, there's been a big investment in actual testing systems in exams and the similar approaches to testing children. Whereas in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, there has been more investment in teacher assessment, in internal school-based assessment for learners. And the importance of these matters, of course, was shown up very recently when it became impossible to use external assessment measures because of the fact that schools were not operating last summer, or not operating in the normal way because of the pandemic. schools were closed or subject to major restrictions, and students were not able to attend unless they had to because of being the children of care of key workers or being in danger at home. So the infrastructure was taken away from teachers' summative judgments in form of external examinations. And so suddenly teachers were being asked, even in England, to make significant judgments about how students were learning. And this really was a shake-up, and it led to great anxiety in England. We'll say more about the impact of COVID in later sessions, but the whole system of assessment was called into question because of the COVID pandemic. So if we think about policy coherence, think about assessment and what's been called achievement for all. In England, one of the ministers for schools said, we're taking action to end years of chronic underperformance. This was said way back in about 2012. And the government was going to target the weakest schools in order to lift up the performance of those weaker schools. In Northern Ireland, a system called INCAS tests were developed to really try and get the most out of learners, but they were designed hopefully to replace the test to gain entrance to grammar schools. In Northern Ireland, there are still grammar schools for the more academic children compared with comprehensive schools for the less academic children. And that's been a problem in Northern Ireland that they were trying to overcome through replacing the transfer test with these more universal INCAS tests. In Scotland, there was no central collection of performance data, of assessment data, although local authorities could collect it. And the government information came from a national survey, annual survey of literacy and numeracy. So far less emphasis on testing, test results school by school. Wales stopped testing in primary schools for a number of years, but then had a very poor performance on PISA. We'll say more about PISA in a moment. And so their confidence in Wales was shaken, and that led not only to reintroducing testing, but to a new school curriculum. In all 4 countries, the raising of achievement for all was part of the language of education policy, often referred to as closing the gap, that concern with raising achievement for all learners, where in fact children from the poorer families tended to be slipping back in their test results compared with the children from the better off families who were making better progress. And so the idea of closing the gap became part of the government rhetoric, in fact, in all 4 countries. And it was always about lifting the bottom up rather, of course, than bringing the top down, even though that would be another way, theoretically, of closing the gap. And I said I'd say a bit more about PISA. Well, this is based on the PISA results from 2009. There's been another, at least one more round, perhaps 2 since then. But PISA is a scheme organized by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And PISA, I know it's a place in Italy, but it also stands for the Program for International Student Assessment. And this is a way of testing the level of achievement or attainment of children in on a national basis. And in 2009, there were some differences. They may look quite small, but England actually did rather poorly. Northern Ireland, with 494 being the average score in England, 499 in Northern Ireland. Scotland did best with 500. And this was a year when Wales wasn't in there. And so England government said, we have sunk in international league tables, the national curriculum is substandard, we must change course. In Northern Ireland, it is they said it's clear from the survey that the progressive countries where selection is not a major factor are capable of outperforming us to a significant degree. These include Scotland, Estonia, Finland, Canada, and New Zealand. Actually, it doesn't really look like a significant degree between 499 for Northern Ireland and 500 for Scotland, but they were worried that they were being outperformed. Of course, the international average was 500. So UK countries were only just reaching that international average. And in Scotland, which did reasonably well and achieved the international average, it was said by ministers there, the PISA results provide further cast iron proof that for Scottish education, the tide has turned. The idea is that things have improved in Scotland in that period. There have been many international critiques of the PISA survey and the influence it's had. There are methodological criticisms of it. What does it really show is a question that's often asked, and it appears to have far more influence than it really should, because it's a limited measure of students' attainment nationally, but yet, as it says in this last point here, politicians use the data that it generates politically. They never question the accuracy of the data. They seek to make a coherence between their own values and policy positions, and they accept the idea of comparison as a proxy for future economic performance. And I mentioned that last week as well, this simplistic notion politicians tend to have that simply by improving attainment in schools, the outcomes in tests, you will have an improvement in economic performance. There's actually very little hard evidence to support that assertion. So to summarize this section, what we have been arguing for is coherence in curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, but we're saying it's a complex business. Policy, practice, research, and values all need to come together. Coherence of culture is important. One person's or one country's success in this competitive atmosphere depends on the failure of another versus the idea of collaboration, cooperation, and community. PISA encourages a competitive view of education, as does a lot of reliance on assessment results. So where to begin? We need a unifying theory of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. We need to build assessment literacy across communities and to investigate the impact of international experimentation in education. So we've dealt with curriculum and assessment. We're now going to go on to talk about pedagogy by asking what we mean by pedagogy, how it relates to teacher agency, how teaching is conceptualized across the 4 nations of the UK, and then to suggest that pedagogy might be seen as teacher agency. What is pedagogy? Well, as far as I'm aware, the first time it was used was in ancient Rome. So your part of the world, the pedagogus, I don't know how you would say it in ancient Latin, but is the slave whose job it was to teach the children of the wealthy elite, particularly Greek, the Greek language, and to read and study Greek. It's a term, pedagogy, that's been much more accepted in many other European countries and elsewhere than it has in England. There's been a kind of aversion, a tendency not to use it in England, as the historian Brian Simon wrote in 1985, "Why no pedagogy in England?" There's been a kind of reluctance to adopt a systematic approach to teaching and learning in England. And in 2004, the comparativist Robin Alexander, who I talked about a lot last week, wrote a chapter called Still No Pedagogy, bemoaning the fact that in spite of Brian Simon's criticism, there had been no real developments of a specifically British or English pedagogy. John Dewey, in the it says 1990, that's a republication of his book from 1913, saw pedagogy as a transactional process, the relationship between the teacher and the learner, the transactions going on. And I think we would argue that pedagogy needs to recognize the tensions inherent in working in contexts in which the micro, meso, and macro level forces that structure a culture's beliefs and values are interacting. So pedagogy is a complex term again, which reflects the nature of the individual, the institution, the society in which learning and teaching are taking place. And if we link it with teacher agency, we would say the difficulty of holding simultaneously the idea of teachers having the capacity to use their professional discretion and at the same time to be accountable to the system, to the school, to the parents, to the community. And a colleague from Scotland called Mark Priestley, working on teacher agency about 10 years ago, talked about the idea of repertoires for maneuver, giving teachers the, yeah, thanks Monica, that's a good way of putting it, giving teachers the scope to develop their own areas of power and influence within their work, a well-articulated educational philosophy related to the wider purposes of education. And this final point here, the iterational aspect of agency, the fact that it unfolds over time, and teachers will develop as they work in their career, and their agency may become more powerful over a period of time. So we can see pedagogy as teacher agency. The tension between that agency and accountability can be productive or it can be destructive. We would hope it would be productive, certainly in the UK. Curriculum assessment and pedagogy need to come together, developing the capacity to lead the child out. That teacher's role, certainly traditionally in the UK, has been to help the child to develop. That's going back to that point about the developmental tradition in primary education. And teachers being able to hold the dynamic between structures and agency in tension, creating those repertoires for maneuver, the scope for decision making, and developing an ecological perspective on the four nations of the UK. And that really means a perspective where there is movement and influence between the micro, the meso, and the macro in education. Across the four nations of the UK, we can ask, to what extent is teaching a technical or an ethical process? The reference at the bottom here is part of your potential follow-up reading. It's an article published in a South African journal by Moira Hume and myself in 2008. And we looked at the approach to teaching across the four nations of the UK. We saw there were elements of travelling policy where influence around standards, for example. Do you remember that Sahlberg term about standards? Those were influencing all four parts of the UK, but they were connecting in different ways according to the history and culture of each of those four nations. So the divergence across the four nations, nearly 15 years ago, we suggested could be seen in the extent to which the profession itself was able to shape the standards, the level of educational literacy expected of teachers. The highest levels of educational literacy were expected in Scotland and Wales. The extent to which the statements about teaching emphasized critical reflection and the dimensions of the teacher's role beyond the classroom. And although it was pre the Donaldson report in Scotland, you will remember me emphasizing how much Donaldson picked up on all four paradigms of teaching in his 2010 report. So there was divergence across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland in the ways that teaching was defined. And then by 2012, we could see a different set of standards in England, new standards for teachers in Wales, the PISA effect. I mentioned that the PISA shock in Wales that led to them taking away testing, but also revising the curriculum. In Northern Ireland, teachers were seen, and probably still are, as public intellectuals, a term that would rarely be used in England. And yet there were market forces at work shaping teachers' work in Northern Ireland. In Scotland, we've had the Donaldson Review, as I mentioned, and consultation on the revision of the standards for teachers in Scotland was underway and were recently relaunched. New standards were relaunched earlier this very year. So that's how things looked in 2012 and subsequently. We might also note that there are different organizations supporting teachers in each of the four nations. Go to Scotland first, where there's been a General Teaching Council since 1965. And that has had a very significant influence on the nature of the teaching profession in Scotland since that time. In England, there was a period when there was a teaching council from about 2000 through to 2010, but that was closed down, and we now see a chartered college of teaching being set up. In Northern Ireland, there is a General Teaching Council, and in Wales, there's something called the Education Workforce Council, which isn't just for teachers, but for all staff who work in schools. And the reason for reminding us of those bodies is that the way in which such bodies are constructed very much reflects the autonomy and indeed the agency of teachers in each of those countries. So it's worth looking when you have a chance at those four different teachers' organizations. Now, have we got a new context for teacher learning and development, which, or it says teacher learning, should say teacher learning and development. And how does that relate to teacher agency? Well, the changing power dynamics of the UK I've mentioned already that there's much more independence now in the three smaller nations than there was before 1998-9. We have four overlapping but unique curriculum and assessment frameworks. Each one is replete with its own take on how to support and enhance teacher development. Teacher reprofessionalization has been evident within opportunities afforded by recent reforms. Even in England, we still get a lot of rhetoric, a lot of discourse about how it's important to see teaching as a profession. But each policy jurisdiction, that is the four nations, reflects a particular set of ideologies, balances, and checks between prescription and freedom, which impact on the reality of teacher agency. So we are seeing differences in the four different parts of the United Kingdom. Teachers can be seen as being caught at the spaces between the structure provided by governments and the agency they have as a profession. And I don't know, again, if any of you have read a bit of sociology, you may be familiar with Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, which is looking at how structures and agency, human agency, interact. Agency is not simply grounded in the self. It's not just about autonomy, individual action, because individuals are always socially and contextually circumscribed. That's the nature of the social world. We may see people as individuals, but they are being shaped all the time by their society and by the context they're living and working in. Teachers always act in relationship with and to their material and social circumstances. So we're not talking about a kind of voluntaristic approach to agency. We are seeing it as a very social process. The capacity for teachers to make free choices and exercise judgment in the classroom is bound by limits set within the context in which they work. So we see teacher agency as being about opportunities to operate within boundaries and within prescribed limits. We're not talking about total anarchy or freedom. What is presently afforded varies by degree across and within each of the four nations. Each of the four nations has a different approach to these matters. However, within each location, teachers are placed too often in a web of contradictory messages and expectations for them to enact their professionalism to the fullest extent. I guess this is a plea for giving teachers a bit more space to develop their approach to their work. There's been just an overload of policy initiatives on teachers, certainly in England, but probably also in the other three jurisdictions. There's a rhetoric of teacher agency, and the reality of differences in trust and respect for teachers to take the right decisions does tend to undermine that commitment that people make to the idea of teacher agency. The reality of differences in sustained collaboration amongst the stakeholders does vary, and I've already indicated that it seems to me that there's much more collaboration in the three nations other than England. So to summarize this part of the talk, we can say that appropriate, that is, emancipatory models of teacher professionalism need to be developed consistent with much of the so-called democratic philosophy of the reforms and reflected through the various frameworks and codes of practice for teacher education and ongoing professional development. See how complex the whole notion of teacher professionalism becomes when you start looking at the idea of agency. The development of new models of teacher development that are fit for purpose and based on workable and coherent approaches, underpinned by understandings of the dynamics of teacher agency over time in teachers' lives, as well as what supports and sustains. We need those kinds of models. Again, it's quite a challenge. And if we ask what has changed since 2012 when these ideas were being developed, well, the biggest impact probably has come from the pandemic, which has accelerated the use of digital technologies in teaching and learning, certainly has in teacher education and in universities, but it's also been the case in schools. And schools across the United Kingdom have had to rely much more than in the past on digital technologies. They've also, as I mentioned, had to develop very rapidly new approaches to assessment that do not require lots of children to sit in a small room at the same time answering test questions. Tony Breslin has written a book about the impact of the pandemic in English schools particularly, but to some extent he's talking about the whole of the UK. And I'll give you that reference later in case you do want to follow it up. But the follow-up reading for today, I've already mentioned that article in the middle by Human Mentor, which is comparing the four parts of the UK and how they approach teaching. If you can get hold of the books mentioned first and third there, that would be great. Stephen Ball, who I'll be referring to again in, I think, probably tomorrow's session, actually, has a really useful book called The Education Debate, which is really about what have been the policy issues in education in England over recent years. And if you're particularly interested in Scotland, then I'd recommend this book by Lindsay Patterson that follows through Scottish education up until the time of devolution, really. Because as I said earlier, there have always been some differences for Scottish education, but they've become more distinctive since devolution in 2000. So if you get a chance, the Human Mentor is on the website and should be accessible to you. So I hope you may have a chance to read that. The discussion topic, which we'll pause in a moment and see whether to get into that today or to leave it until tomorrow, was to be what does contemporary education policy in the 4 UK nations tell us about the influence of history and culture? And that was picking up the themes from last week about the vernacular globalization, the idea that things are happening globally, but they always get mediated by the particular history and culture of the nation where they're arriving. And I would ask, how does that compare to Italy? What does contemporary education policy in Italy tell us about the influence of history and culture? The references that I've referred to are given on that slide. And before you go and we talk about tomorrow's session, there is some pre-reading for tomorrow's session, which I think Monica Mincu did suggest you might try and read in advance of today, given that there's only 24 hours between today's session and tomorrow's. But there's 2 chapters from that book by the Teacher Education Group. There's the literature review from the Scottish Government that I referred to on Wednesday. And there's a journal article by Whiting and colleagues about teacher education in England. And then the final one there, Mentor, Mutton and Burn, is a chapter from a book I'll be referring to a lot more tomorrow about teacher education in England. So that concludes the slides and the presentation for today. We do have a few minutes left. So Monica, I'll take your advice. Should we just pause and see if there are questions that people would like to ask to explain things? Because I know I've used a lot of quite technical language today, and it's difficult for non-native speakers to follow. Or we could go to the discussion topic. What do you suggest, Monica?
Well, I think their questions have been raised in the chat. Actually, we had some sort of exchanges. I tried to facilitate their understanding. If they have some questions, maybe they can raise them. But it is also interesting to try to think about the topics that you propose straight away and to see how can we answer to this.
Yeah.
If someone may wish to engage with the first question, for instance.
Yeah.
Let's try to do a brainstorm. Let's try to say, you know, from your, it's important for us as well to see the level of your understanding. So from your perspective, from your understanding, so do not be worried about any mistakes or whatever.
Yeah. There's not a right answer to this question. It's a question for exploration, and you can come back at that question with your own questions if you like, because I think it's quite a challenging question. Anyone want to start us off? Turn your microphone on and jump in there.
Yeah. In which ways did you see the influence of history and culture in the story that you have heard on the education in UK? Could you see that influence of history and culture in any way? Which are the ways that were more visible to you or could were more striking, how to say, more powerful in your view?
I don't know if it is correct, but I think that there is fragmentation between different countries. I don't know.
What was that word? There is what between different countries?
Fragmentation. She said there is.
Fragmentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be? Because I think you're right, but what has caused that fragmentation, do you think?
Because I see that in the northern of Galles, Scotland, there is a different policy education.
Yeah.
And maybe can be significate fragmentation.
Yeah.
Country, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's right. I didn't say a lot about history and culture in the talk, but I think you are getting a sense of the difference, because what I did mention early on was national identity. And for me, certainly in this fragmented United Kingdom, to use your word, the education system is part of helping each country, each nation, to feel that it is distinctive, that it's not part of, it's not the same as England. Many Americans tend to see England and Britain as the same country. That's a common misconception we find from American visitors to this country. Well, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, there's a great desire to be clear that the histories are different and the cultures are different. And so I think you are touching on something that is very relevant to this question. We could also talk about, in the culture, about the standing, the status of education and the standing and status of teachers, because it seems to me that in Scotland and Wales especially, teachers are seen as in a more positive way than they perhaps are in England. Tomorrow, I think I'll be talking about the discourse of derision, the way in which teachers are talked about in a bad way in England by certain groups of people. And I think the cultural esteem of teachers is part of what has led to the differences in education policy. So thanks for that. Was that Chiara? Anybody else want to come in on this?
Altri modi per avvicinarsi ad una risposta con una domanda, con un pensiero, quindi senza problemi.
Maybe also there are differences in how much the state is involved and how much teachers are involved in decisions about education policies. I think England is more centered in some ways than Scotland, for example. So the differences about teachers who are more or less free and more or less involved in decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa. That's very helpful. I think you are right to suggest there's more sort of central management of teachers in England than there is in the other countries. And that is certainly part of why the policies have been different. The government has taken a much more assertive approach in England than in the other parts of the UK. And I think that has influenced the way in which policies have developed in the different countries. So thank you for that. Any more before we wrap up? Yeah.
I'm glad to discover that more freedom in Scotland are linked to best results in PISA.
Yeah,
So
it's
teachers are the key.
yeah, it's interesting that, and the influence of PISA is very strange. And if you ever get a chance to read that Farsi Salberg book that I referred to last week, he does point out the contradictions of ministers relying so heavily on PISA, because actually his own country, Finland, did very well on PISA, but does not follow these hard-line assessment procedures and attempts to raise attainment that everybody else seems to think leads to improvement. So there are real contradictions there. Well, Monica, it is 6 o'clock in your country. It's 5 o'clock in mine. I think it might be time to draw things to a close.
I think. Sorry, Ian. Yeah.
I was going to say, and to remind people that we're meeting tomorrow or Tuesday, not Wednesday.
Yes.
But at the same time, at 4 o'clock your time. And we'll be focusing again on the United Kingdom, but looking particularly at teacher education rather than school education. So I hope people have coped with what I've been saying today, and we'll try and create a bit more space tomorrow for people to ask questions and make contributions. But do be ready to ask about the reading you've done as well. So thanks, Monica. Back to you.
It has been very dense, and I think, yes, it's okay to let them maybe time for tomorrow as well. And okay, I please ask you as well to try to get some reading before the session. And if you have questions, you can also write me, as I said, through email. You can raise some questions if you have. But anyway, on the platform, or you can also ask Professor Mentor tomorrow if you have questions. Okay. On the platform on e-learning, I have created a blog on the teacher professionalism issues. So you can include there your thoughts that you had today, or try to react. We can try to collect there your ideas if you wish. Okay.
That's great, Monica. Thank you very much.
Okay, so see you everybody tomorrow. Thank you very much, Ian, for your very interesting and very important lecture of today. And so see everybody tomorrow.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
Ok, bye bye.
Ciao.
Ciao ragazze. Sì.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Aspettate a scrivermi se avete delle